Get yourself in the lotus position, because I've got no plan, no pretense, and definitely no bypassing. I'm Josh Connolly, and this will probably be dysfunctional. Welcome back. And for the first time ever, I have double checked I'm recording before we've even started. So you won't need me to get up and check, those of you watching on YouTube, halfway through to see if I'm recording. I can assure myself and all of you who know anyway because you're watching that I am recording. And good to be here again. And today we're going to be talking about therapy. And this is born out of a post that I did on social media. I actually put it across LinkedIn, Instagram and TikTok. I put it on TikTok and Instagram first, and then I'll put it on LinkedIn. And essentially, if you haven't seen it, you should go and check it out. But the video is one of the skit videos that I do. And it says POV, because I'm down with the kids. Point of view, your therapist is an enabler. And just, it basically highlights how wrong therapists can get it. And how wrong they can get these things. And I just want to see actually if I'm signed in on my LinkedIn profile, because there was one particular comment on there that I'd really like to show you as we get into it. So the premise of what we're going to do today, no, I can't find it. I'll have to paraphrase when we get there. The premise of what I want to do today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own experiences with therapy. And then I want to get into some of the pros and cons, really. We'll look at like the history of it. And some really interesting things came up as a result of the post that I put on Instagram and across social media platforms. A lot of the comments on there were super interesting. Now, listen, before I get into this, right, I'm going to tell you about it in a minute. I'm not like against therapy, right? In all of the things that I discuss, I'm always about having the difficult conversations. One of the things that I realize is that a lot of therapists really don't understand complex family dynamics. A lot is harsh. There are some therapists who don't understand it, and I just want to explore that. I also want to explore the notion that therapy is the perfect job for a toxic, horrible person. And you've got to understand the lengths that these people will go to. So I want to try and get into that. But all of that aside, before we get into it, I know some amazing therapists. I think therapy is amazing. I think people should do it. Like I've just said, the recent bout of therapy that I've had has literally just finished. I've talked about it on here. Come on here. I did some amazing therapy with a guy called Kevin who... it was IFS, internal family systems therapy, and I had some fucking huge breakthroughs. Sat one-to-one with him on Zoom, okay? So I'm not against therapy. I just like to explore the difficult conversations. I think we live in a world where, or in a society, at least in Western culture, where there are common narratives. And if you challenge them in any way, whether it's rooted in truth or whether it's rooted in trying to seek what's right for everybody to push us forward, if you dare to go against the common narrative, you're often ostracized. And look, I think that I don't want to, there will be people that swear by therapy and that might get triggered by some of the things that I'm saying. So I'm not taking away your therapy, right, and how good it is for you. I'm not saying if you're a therapist that you're bad. I'm going to talk about certain styles of therapy. I'm going to talk about how some I think are problematic, that I think are born out of the wrong reasons. Again, if you are a therapist of the type that I mentioned when I get there, I'm not saying that what you're doing is bad. So let me just say that at the beginning. I think it's worth saying that when I'm going to be talking about some crunchy subjects. All right. So look, my first ever experience of therapy was actually counselling, right? And I'm sort of grouping one-to-one modalities together at the moment in terms of like counselling and therapy. I was still drinking at the time. I wasn't anywhere near being able to admit my problems. But I remember I sat down and this chap, lovely fella, sure he was great at his job. It was, I didn't have any money. I was in a bad place. So it was all like, I don't know if he was a volunteer or if it was through a charity or what, I don't remember. But I remember telling him very early on in one of the sessions about what happened with my dad and some of the things that I saw with my dad. And then I saw him, he like broke down, this chap, and really cried. And I had to sort of sit there, right? Bear in mind, one of my struggles at the time was I was terrified of big, difficult emotions. And I had to sit there and sort of look at this chap cry while he regathered his thoughts, right? And so it was a really, really bad experience that put me off for a long time. And again, look, I'm not blaming him, but it did put me off. But then more recently, as I've just said, I've had some amazing one-to-one therapy sessions. And I've had different coaches that I've done one-to-one over the years. I had some IFS therapy once or twice with a lady named Madeline in more recent years, and she was brilliant. I had some massive, breakthroughs and big realizations for that. So that style of therapy, IFS particularly, really, really works for me, right? So it's really like great for me to sit down and do that style of therapy, right? But it's just understanding that you have to get the right therapist for you. So you can get the wrong therapist for you and it be a brilliant therapist, but just not the right one for you as well. So I think that's important. And that's why we need to have these important conversations that I'm going to try and have today and get into. To give you like a brief history, because people don't really realize it, but one-to-one therapy, one-to-one talking therapy, sitting down one-to-one with another therapist is like a relatively new concept, right? Relatively speaking to the history of time. So Freud and the birth of talk therapy, we all know who Freud is, right? Sigmund Freud was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Sigmund Freud, who's known as the father of psychoanalysis, he developed the idea of talking about your problems in a structured setting could lead to healing. His model focused on the unconscious mind, and he was all about childhood experiences and deep-seated conflicts. While groundbreaking at the time, a lot of his theories have since been dismissed. Carl Rogers, who for me, the person-centered approach, humanistic approach, was in the 1950s to the 1960s. He introduced, Carl Rogers did, person-centered therapy, shifting away from this heavy focus on the past. His model emphasized empathy, active listening, and letting clients find their own solutions rather than being analyzed. This is my favorite type, right? I believe, in similar ways to a lot of the literature that I've read with Carl Rogers, that people at their core really do know them. They, are the experts as themselves. They know what they need and what they want. They just need to be supported into seeing and discovering that about themselves. Then you've got cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, which came around in the 70s and the 90s. Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis developed CBT, which focuses on identifying and changing negative thought patterns. Unlike Freud's deep analysis, CBT is short and solution focused. It's become dominant form of therapy in the West, mainly because it's structured and easy to measure. Look, I don't know if they're two of the best reasons for it to become one of the most prominent types of therapy that you can get, that it's structured so it's sort of easy to roll out, and that it produces good measurements. We'll talk about that. CBT is one of the ones that I'm going to come back to talk about. And then the rise of therapy in the 2000s, it became big business. You've got lots of private practices, and online therapy platforms and mental health apps are booming. Again, I'm not against these, right? I'm not against these at all. I'm not against therapists making money. I think the best therapists should make money. I think therapists should make money, right? I think we live in capitalist society, and that's how it works, right? And if you want to do this for a living, then you have to make money out of it, right? That's true of anything. However, once you introduce that and it becomes capitalism, right, then you have to introduce marketing, right? And so then this can affect it, right? And so I make money out of what I do, right? So I'm not here pointing fingers saying people shouldn't make money, right? I know amazing therapists that make money. Of course they do. It's their job, right? And we just have to, I think, be conscious and aware that once we introduce that and once we make it mainstream in that way and people are making money out of it, that could influence their practice. I'm not saying it does. I'd like to think it doesn't influence what I do. I'd like to think that I am a purpose-driven person who doesn't have a money-first approach. But you can absolutely see how people can get pulled into that. So it can then start to play a role, a negative one. We might suspect potentially. So again, some people really struggle to listen to conversations like this and go, and not just go, he's saying that all therapists care about is money. I'm not saying that at all. And I bet there are some that only care about money, right? So you can just see that it starts to influence it. That's what I'm saying. The idea that everybody should have a therapist became mainstream, and therapy was no longer just for people in crisis. I read a book called, I think it's called Bad Therapy, which might even become the title of this podcast, by the way. But I read it. It was I often read books with people that I disagree with, right? And I'd seen her on actually Joe Rogan talking about some stuff, and it felt prickly when I was listening to what she was saying about there being too much therapy out there and people doing therapy too much. And I actually read her book, and as much as I had a sense that I disliked the lady that wrote it, and I didn't really believe with the way that she argued a lot of things, and she wasn't my type of person. By the way, when I say I don't like her, I'm not saying she's a bad person. She's not my type of person. I think she made some really valuable points in there. I think she made some really valuable points about how we don't have to open everything up with therapy. Some things are best left over there and we can feel them and they influence us, but we don't have to, everything doesn't have to become this big, let's drill down deep into it. And I say that as somebody who drills down deep, loves drilling down deep into everything, but it's problematic for me sometimes. Sometimes things would just be better left over there. So I think there's something in that. And, I do believe, and I don't know where I fully sit with it, but I do believe that there's an argument to be had. One of the points actually that this book made, and I can't remember the terminology that was used in the book, but when you take like physical health, whenever you have a physical operation, so my appendix, for example, my appendix burst when I was younger, there's always a risk when you, I can't remember the terminology they used in the book. You'll have to forgive me, but there's a risk, right? When you have an operation. So a doctor will always weigh up the options, right? Is it worth operating? Should we try and combat this with antibiotics? Because once you start cutting somebody open to remove the appendix, it might be a small risk, but there's still a risk there, right? So with your appendix, they'll often at first they don't just whip them out straight away. They'll try and give you antibiotics because you don't really want to have an op if you don't want to. The risks, again, are really low, but there are risks. So you have to weigh them up. Mine burst, so the operation became one that you should do. And the book was arguing, and I think there's definitely something in this, that there is a risk in going into therapy, right? You could open up wounds that didn't need opening up, that you were managing, that you were doing quite well, leaving in the background and all that kind of stuff. So you have to weigh up the options. Like, am I hurting enough to really do this or not? Again, I'm stepping back and looking at this from a top layer view as I can. I sort of enjoy, I don't know why, I enjoy going in and going deep and opening up wounds and stuff like that. So like, what she's suggesting in that book doesn't speak necessarily to me, but I can absolutely see how somebody who's not into it and doesn't really enjoy it, perhaps it's slightly strange that I enjoy it even in and of itself, right? But if somebody that doesn't enjoy it, there's a risk there. If we just if we just blanket sent everybody to therapy and gave everybody therapy, would there be a net positive from that? I don't know. I think there's a discussion to be had on that. And then I've noted that I believe that there can become problems when therapy became over medicalized. We started treating human suffering like a disorder instead of a response to life circumstances. But again, there's a whole conversation to be had about that. Then you have to have a look at like who's delivering the therapy, how up to date together on their own stuff are they. And people will say to me, yeah, but when you're a therapist, you have to go and see a therapist regularly all the time, particularly if you're part of, a regulated board. But listen, I can go to a therapist, right? And I can make the therapist think we've had an amazing session and had loads of breakthroughs and we haven't done anything, right? I'm a people pleaser. And so if I go to a therapist, the therapist I'll work out why they've asked me the question, give them a good answer for it. They think, wow, yeah, then they do some more. And then they start thinking we've having breakthroughs and they haven't touched the sides. I'm just people pleasing and making them feel like a good little therapist. So the idea that if you send a therapist to therapy, that automatically they're going to be working on their stuff, that's not necessarily always true. I mean, I think it's certainly useful, right? And it's certainly, you're minimizing you're decreasing the chances of a therapist being unhealed within practice, but you're not getting rid of it, are you? And then I've written down, because I think this is really important, Western bias. Often whenever I'm speaking, you may have heard me, may do this on the podcast. I don't know how often I do it in podcasts, but certainly when I'm talking about resilience, when I go into companies and stuff, I will always say in Western culture at least. And sometimes people say to me, well, what you think it's not like that in other cultures? And I'm like, listen, I don't know about other cultures. And there's an arrogance in the West, I believe, when it comes to mental health, if we call it that, where we think that our way is the only way or the right way. And we think actually, right, we think that Eastern philosophies and Eastern ways of looking at stuff, I don't know if people might frame their experience in a way where they say if somebody dies early or somebody has voices in their head, in some cultures, they will say that is like a positive thing. It's a good thing. Whereas over here, we just think we're more advanced. So we just think it's crazy, right? And there's an arrogance in that. And you see it, things like meditation being brought in, westernized, and then brought in as if we fucking made them up ourselves, right? As if they don't have their origins in Eastern philosophy. So I think there's a real arrogance in that. So to come on to what I talked about in the post about, and I've sort of touched on it a little bit here, like unhealed therapists or even toxic and abusive therapists. I just want to read a couple of the comments actually that I've got, and then there was a few. Firstly, actually, let's start with the comment that I had on LinkedIn that I meant to screenshot for myself, and I haven't. But one guy on there, so I put it on there, and then I said a chap commented, and I think he was sort of a mental health professional of some kind. He commented and said, I don't think therapists like this exist, or something like that. I'm going to have to paraphrase, I'm afraid. And I said, well, look, there's far too many of them, right? Bearing in mind, I think fucking one toxic, enabling, abusive therapist is too many, right? I was like, but unfortunately, I don't think I said far too many. I think I said, unfortunately, there's more, this is more common than we believe. And he said to me, I don't like this, sweeping statements. If I was seeking therapy and I heard that you said that there are toxic and horrible ones out there, I might not seek therapy. To which I said, would you prefer that we just tell everybody that if they're a therapist, then they're safe? Because that's a breeding ground for abuse. What we have to understand about abuse is that abuse happens within relationship normally, not always, right? But particularly emotional abuse happens when there is a power dynamic within a relationship. It's a breeding ground for abuse. When I trust that what somebody is telling me is true and from a place of knowing more than me, there is the potential for abuse. That's why it happens within families. That's why most emotional abuse and lots of prolonged abuse happens when a relationship of trust is built. There is a power dynamic. So the idea that so in therapy, of course, there is a power dynamic. There's a power structure. That doesn't mean that every therapist abuses it. Of course it doesn't. Same as every person that works with children, like I do, is not gonna abuse it and be a paedophile, right? It would be ridiculous to suggest that. We don't want to scare everybody into thinking that anybody that works with children is a paedophile. And we want to do our due diligence, right? That's why we have DRB checks. And if you want to go and work with kids now, you have to go through a rigorous check, and rightly so. Again, it doesn't stop and prevent it. And so if a child, I'm going off down a bit of a rabbit hole here, I can see, but if a child started showing signs and symptoms that kind of relationship was being abused, you would look into it. You wouldn't just go, well, they've done their DRB check, so they definitely are not abusive. You would look into it. So the same is true in the therapeutic relationship. Now, when we're talking about adults, it becomes even more difficult because the power structure still exists, and it's very difficult then. Subtle emotional kinds of abuse, gaslighting, then would be very easy to carry out. You only have to look at the comments on Instagram. There was over 250 comments from people, lots of them talking about how they had experienced this. I'm going to read one to you now. Actually, no, this lady, I'm not going to read her name out, but she's an amazing lady, therapist herself, believe it or not. And she said, I once had a therapist ask me, was I in some way playing a part in a family member attacking me? She said, some of the story doesn't add up. What part did you play in her calling unannounced, as you say, and attacking you out of the blue? I will never forget how I felt driving away from her house. I felt so hopeless, like I was trapped and no one would ever understand. And I also felt like I was to blame. Thankfully, maybe 2 therapists later, which is an important point because it shows that this lady went on to go through another couple of therapists until she found the right one, found the one that made me feel seen. By the way, the 2 other therapists, I was too ashamed to bring the story again. So you can see that the problem that caused. Now, by the way, I recognize that we live in a society where finding the correct therapist and being able to bin therapists off and find new ones is a privilege in itself, right? So that's a whole nother layer that we're probably not even going to get into talking about today. Here was another one. This is a hypnotherapist whose name I won't read out again. Yes, I hear you on this one. Therapists have said to me, now say 3 good things about them after I disclosed the most painful memories of sheer narcissistic toxic abuse. And one said, draw a fishhook with a stick man on. Save it on your phone as your screensaver to remind you all week to let them off the hook. But they're still doing it, and I can't let them off the hook. Was met with, I'm not engaging in therapy. So when this lady said, look, but this person's still abusing me, then she said, well, you're not engaging in, you're not trying to fucking come towards the therapy that I'm offering you. And this person adds, that's an NHS therapist too, right? I never tell a client to forgive, this person says, or to sugarcoat of whitewash anything they share about toxic and abusive people that they've encountered. So you can see this is hugely problematic. Now, listen, I think some of this is driven by a lack of understanding. I do. That's an NHS therapist, so they will be regulated. I think this is driven sometimes by a good place. But make no mistake about it. Toxic, abusive, and horrible people, these are the spaces they go into. Now, most of them, this is when regulation is important. And I'm going to talk about this in a moment, or while regulation can help. There's pros and cons to it, and I don't know where I'm at with it. A lot of them will go into like the spiritual realm. There's a lot of abusive people in the spiritual realm because they go in there and it's easier for them to carry out their kind of emotionally abusive behavior where they can place themselves at the center of the universe and act out their narcissistic traits. But many of them would end up as therapists, right? There's no two ways. There's no two ways about that. Let me just come back to my notes here. But even when you look at like regulation, so let's talk about another comment. And I made a video about this particular comment where somebody basically said to me in their comment, not being able to articulate the abuse that you experienced is a surefire sign that there was no abuse there. And I mean, give me a moment. That made me really angry because that's like just makes abuse thrive, right? So I'm just going to talk about some scandals with therapy over the past. There was the repressed memories scandal. So I want to talk about a lot of people said, and I think quite rightly, but I just want to explore it. A lot of people talked about it needs to be better regulated, right? Right now, anybody can call themselves a therapist, right? I sort of understand that because, like, I don't know, if you wanted to be a breathwork therapist, then you'd be a breathwork. I would never do that because I just think that I wouldn't say the word therapist, but people would say massage therapist, wouldn't they? So, like, I would never say it because I think that once you start calling yourself a therapist, I think it shows that you're professionally trained. However, I look, it doesn't solve the problem. Would it reduce it? Would it reduce it if we made it more regulated? Yes, and there's huge problems, right? Let's just look at some of the things. There was the repressed memory scandals in the 80s and 90s. So some therapists, particularly in the US, pushed the idea that childhood trauma could be repressed and only uncovered through therapy. And this led to a wave of false memories where people recovered memories of abuse that never actually happened, right? And the takeaway that we can have from that is that therapists hold a lot of power over clients' perception of reality. I think this is really important. Like, the power dynamic is so strong. We know that in an abusive relationship, your abuser can change your, go back and listen to the gaslighting episode from last week. You'll see that people can change your reality, right? They can make you question your reality. When you're in this therapeutic space, they have huge power over you. And if they are regulated and they're toxic and horrible, we've got a real issue. I found a case here where Vanessa Feltz, well-known British TV personality, was married to a high-profile therapist. After the marriage ended, she later spoke about how he used therapy techniques to manipulate and gaslight her. Some therapists, especially those with narcissistic tendencies, right, and they fucking do exist, believe me, use their training to control their partners, friends, or even their clients. And there's a word that I want to find in here, and I'm going to find it because I made a note of it. I bet I'm not going to be able to find it now. Oh yeah, that's what we're going to talk about in a second. I've got some other examples here, but what I'm saying to you is that becoming a therapist is the perfect role if you're a narcissist or if you're a toxic person. Should we say that? And so, if we were to set this, if we were to say that we need to better regulate the whole system, and if we better regulate the whole system, then we will get rid of lots of them. I just don't know how true that is. What we would have to be aware of, first of all, what I want to talk about, I've got the word here, is credentialism. Credentialism is the idea that just because somebody has got some letters on their name, that somebody has been down the route and got themselves qualified as a qualified therapist and are now regulated by a certain board, that means they're not going to be toxic and horrible. And there are cases, and I had a case somewhere, I'm not going to be able to find it. Oh yeah, here we go. The Larry Nassar case in 2018. Larry Nassar, the USA gymnastic team doctor and licensed therapist, sexually abused hundreds of young athletes under the guise of medical treatment. Many survivors later revealed that because he was a respected, licensed professional, they felt unable to question him. Even when complaints were made, the system protected him for years. The title and credentials of a therapist can make them untouchable. That's one of the main things that we have to be really, really careful about. This is where toxic and horrible people will go. If they can go and get themselves tickets to be able to do this, right? That is what they're going to do. And then we are gifting them and giving them huge power. So if we regulate it in that way, we have to then introduce more safety measures. They should be under a fucking huge spotlight, especially if they're working with kids, by the way. And look, there's lots of other chat as well around therapists keeping you in a therapy loop because that's how they earn their money. And look, I'm sure, I don't know how common that is. I bet it does happen. I bet it does play a role. And there was one interesting comment. I was looking for it for ages this morning that I couldn't find. And it was a lady who talked about how therapy, when she was a teenager, was really, really a really negative, problematic experience for her. But as an adult, has been much better. And she cited a couple of reasons. She grew up with, in her own words, I think, toxic parents. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but dysfunctional parents. But through the system that she had found herself in, she was with this therapist who was basically trying to get her to see her parents in a better light. And she made a really, really good point, which is like, if a teenager is stuck with the toxic parents, right, and they're still living with them, I mean, it's a really difficult thing to have. If the abuse is like under the rug, emotional abuse, which it often is, which is under the rug, so you're not going to get these kids removed from their parents. How do you then run therapy sessions with a child like that? Right, knowing that they've got to go home to the parents? Can you fully identify that they're like toxic and horrible to them? Can you help? Are you going to help them understand that? I don't know. It becomes very, very complex, and I think this person raises a really, really good point. And instead, I guess you'd have to just focus on them and how do you. But if they wanted to talk about their parents, it makes it really difficult. It makes it a really difficult conversation. And then the second thing, and I think I've talked about this in previous podcasts, but actually they might have been on the old 115 Miles podcast, but once you introduce regulation of any kind, you get a group of people sat around a table and they get to decide what is right and what's wrong. And so then you get into this problem of what we see in the wider conversation around mental health and all that kind of stuff, which is where people get to decide what is disordered. And I've been into this a little bit, I always bring the example of generalized grief disorder, which is a fairly new disorder, listed disorder, where at some point, some people have had to sit around the table and decide what is appropriate lengths of time and appropriate reactions for your grief. And if it doesn't fall into what they believe to be normal, then you can be labeled as disordered. And that is ultimately, when you get into the realms of regulation, that's a real problem that you come by. So for me personally today, when I'm looking for a therapist, I'm not interested in credentials, personally. I'm interested in how the person makes me feel, my nervous system feel. But I would argue that comes because I'm in I don't want to say this with any kind of arrogance, but I've done quite a bit of work on myself. I'm quite confident in where I'm at. I'm not particularly a vulnerable person. A vulnerable person who's at the beginning of their journey doesn't have the ability to see how the person makes me feel. So there's a lot here, and I appreciate that I'm not fully answering or giving any full and proper opinions on this stuff, because it is complex and it's muddy. The thing that I did want to talk about, I did want to have a little bit of a conversation around yeah, some of the concerns around therapy today, some of the things that I've listed here, like therapy, Western therapy has been put forward as like the be all and end all mentality. Like, it's the best thing to do. The best therapies for me have been somatic practices, by the way. Internal family systems is regulated through internal family systems stuff. Richard Schwartz, who's a therapist, right? But it's a different style of therapy. For me, my own practice in the sauna and looking at somatic practices and grouping things together has been really, really powerful for me. I prefer personally body work over rational speaking, but that's personal preference. We talked about regulation. I've gone off on a lot of tangents, but to summarize the regulation, people assume regulation will stop bad therapists, but people can still manipulate systems. And that risk of credentialism, just because someone has a license, it doesn't mean that they're safe. That's a really important thing to think about. And how power and authority can actually protect harmful therapists. And we've seen examples of that. The American example that I gave you. If there is a toxic, horrible, manipulative member within a board that wants to protect themselves because they're highly funded and they think that their regulation system is the best, you can see how cover-ups start to happen, particularly if these toxic and horrible people get themselves into positions of power. And look, don't nobody tell me that it's hard to get yourself in a position of power if you're toxic and horrible. Look at the state of politics in the world today. Look who's in the fucking biggest seats in the world in many aspects, and tell me whether you think that you would want them people running. Let's fucking be clear and direct with what I'm saying. Trump. Would you want somebody like Trump regulating the therapy system? Because he's fucking president of the United States, right? So you have to be aware of that. So I did look, and then, by the way, on the regulation point, this is the other thing that I wanted to do. I promised I would come back and talk about CBT. Look, if you're a CBT therapist, you might want to close your ears now, so I'm not going to be very complimentary of it. But I think I know people that CBT has been amazing. They did CBT therapy and it's brilliant. But CBT is preferred because it can show quick fire results very, very quickly. It can be really problematic, particularly for people that have experienced trauma. And I'm going to oversimplify it now, but if I'm in a room with a therapist and they're trying to get me to do some work and I'm a chronic people pleaser and they're like, rate how you feel now. And I'm like, well, out of 10 and 2, 1's not good and 10's good. I might go, well, 2, I feel shit, right? That therapist is going to do their thing, right? They're going to work here and we're going to do this. And can we look at it this way? And what about this solution-based stuff? Right? And then at the end of the session, they go, how do you feel now? I ain't going to say 2 again because I'm a people pleaser. So I'm going to go, all right, yeah, 4, even if I still feel shit. I'm going to go a bit of a higher number. So then you see that you can get these kind of false results. You can do CBT therapy over 6 weeks. You give people the tools to kind of almost gaslight themselves and look at silver linings and all of that stuff, right? And again, that's an oversimplification. But it's loved as a result of that by the NHS. It's loved and it's thrown at people, slapped on like a pasta, and it's a huge problem. And again, that's regulated, ran by good people, and the regulator believes that we should use CBT because it makes the regulator look fucking brilliant because lots of people go in and go from a 2 to a 4. And again, I'm giving you a really oversimplified idea of what I'm talking about, but you can see again how regulation can be problematic, right? It doesn't solve the problem, as good as it may be, and it may eradicate some of the more simple base level grifters. So let's try and summarize what I've said. At the end of the day, therapists are just people. There's good people, there's bad people. Most people are a bit of good and bad. And what you have to understand is that within a therapeutic relationship, there is a huge power dynamic where the power lies in the hands of the therapist. So whether you like it or not, there will always be toxic and horrible people that become therapists. and that then work their way up to the top of these therapy ladders so that they're controlling the fucking game. Yeah. Or have some control in the game. So we should be arming people with as much knowledge as we can to let them know that, like, you might have a bad therapist, you might have an horrible therapist, and you should look at that and you should feel empowered to be able to go, this isn't working and I don't even need to give a good reason. Listen, if you're in a therapeutic relationship with a therapist and you say, this, I don't think this is working, a good therapist will help you find another therapist. Yeah. So the reaction will say a lot. Therapy is an amazing tool. I've talked about how I've just come off the back of my own therapy myself, and it's been hugely benefiting. And it isn't the be all and end all. I think that there's lots of amazing, incredible ways out there. New ways. People come up with new ways, right? People come up with new programs that they do. Grifters come up with new programs. People who are trying to scam people out of money come up with new programs. Good, brilliant minds with great new ideas come out with new programs too. Again, regulation might prevent that happening. Regulation in and of itself hands the power to a group of people, and we should be careful and wary of that. Whenever we hand power to people, they may start off with the right thing and the right things in mind, but power is the most addictive thing out there, and money's fucking right up there with it. So we can see how we have to be really, really careful whenever we hand power to people. All right, we have to be really, really careful. And I guess when you look at the work that I do, toxic and horrible people exist everywhere. And just because somebody's got a ticket or a few numbers behind their name, letters behind their name, it doesn't mean that they can't be toxic and horrible. And I guess let's finish here on a more light and nice note. Lots of good people become therapists. Don't give up on therapy, just be aware. I'm not fucking doing therapy down. I'm saying we should be aware. We should feel empowered to understand and know that we can see people for who they are and get the experience that we want, need, and deserve out of therapy. If anything, I hope this has made you more curious. I think what I tried to do is bring loads of stuff, try and look at it from all angles. And Johann Hari is one of my favorite people. And sometimes when I read his books, by the end of them, I feel armed with even more knowledge to be able to have a balanced discussion, but even more confused on where my opinion lies. And I hope that's what I can try and do with this podcast. So, you know what's coming. As always, I have been Josh Connolly. And this was definitely dysfunctional. I did tell you it would be dysfunctional, so thank you for sticking around till the end here. And if you have enjoyed this podcast, then please help me to grow Dysfunctional by sharing with your friends on social media. You can find me at Josh_FFW. And then wherever you're listening to this or watching this, please make sure that you've liked and subscribed, left us a 5-star review and a comment if your platform allows it. And I'll see you on the next one.